Thank you all for tuning into Gardens and Guitars lately. I realize the channel has been severely neglected. I took up disc golf, and now all I do is play disc golf hours and hours a day, every day. And while I'm still maintaining a couple acres worth of garden at this point, I got my front yard garden, my side yard container garden, the backyard fruit orchard, and then down the street from me there's about a 2-acre plot that's kind of a guerrilla garden, no irrigation, no inputs, just old-fashioned. All this came out of the front yard this morning. I wanted to mention briefly kind of a change in my tomato protocol. I go into it a little bit more in the garden, but I used to do, the best tasting varieties. I would grow all these exotic heirlooms like Cherokee Purple and all this stuff that tastes amazing and has historical value, but the yields were never great. And I would put all this time into staking them and trellising them and pruning them very carefully and giving them high-end fertilizers and just the whole bit, and it really wasn't worth it, the yields I was getting for the amount of labor I was putting in. I'm much more focused on post-collapse subsistence type farming at this point, which is going to be very low input. Post-collapse, we're not going to have access to high-end Fox Farm potting mix and fancy fish emulsion fertilizer and all that. We'll be making all of our own fertilizers. So subsistence type farming, off-grid farming, low input farming. I'm a big fan of, I always pronounce his name wrong, Masanobu Fukuoka, the Japanese philosopher and pioneer of what they call ecological farming or nature farming, often referred to as do-nothing farming. The idea where rather than putting all of this effort into individual plants and bringing in high-end fertilizers and plastic and drip tape and tomato cages and all these fancy trellises, and it's kind of the opposite model. You focus on developing an ecosystem, and then you select for the things that naturally do well in that ecosystem. So rather than forcing your will on the environment and saying, I'm going to grow Cherokee Purple tomatoes even if you live in Florida. So I've kind of switched to that do-nothing farming model. I'll specifically plant varieties that are disease resistant, and I just kind of let them go. All these tomatoes, as you'll see in the other part of the video in the front yard, they were just sprawling all over the ground. There was no staking, there was no pruning, there was no trellising, there was no weed control, there was no insect control, no fungus control. It was a bunch of wrangly vines just growing all over the ground, and fruits touching the ground, leaves touching the ground. Very messy looking, but low input. I stuck, 5 or 6 tomato plants in the ground in the front yard and didn't do anything else. I didn't fertilize them, I didn't water them, I didn't prune them, I didn't go out there and spray anything on them. There was crabgrass growing all around them, but a handful of them did quite well. And yeah, most of these are disease-resistant varieties. You probably couldn't take some historical heirloom that tastes amazing and is full of sugar and just let it sprawl all over the ground, but these are mostly Romas, and my goal now is processing. It's pretty hot here in the summer. I think today is going to be 105, maybe 110 with the heat index. And so when I bring tomatoes in the house is probably 85 degrees most of the day. And so a tomato sitting on the counter is going to rot pretty quickly anyway. Tomatoes in the fridge the flavors aren't great. So processing makes a whole lot more sense for me. Instead of growing tomatoes for fresh eating, for salads, for sandwiches, I'm growing tomatoes so that I can put up jars of marinara. I don't want to be in front of a hot stove in the summer, so I'm not doing pressure canning or water bath canning. I'm going to cook all these down for about an hour in the stock pot on the stove, and then they're going to go into mason jars. I got basil, oregano, apple mint, and some other herbs from the garden to put in here, and I'm going to fill probably 20 or 30 quart mason jars and stick them in the freezer. And I'll have marinara sauce for spaghetti and pizza all winter. And again, this was very, very low input. I started these tomato plants from seed that I saved from last year, so I didn't pay anything for the seeds. I started them indoors back into December, early January. I stuck them out in the garden the last week of March, first week of April, and just let them sprawl all over the place. Um, it was high risk, high reward, I think, but low input, so we're maximizing yields while minimizing inputs. That's the way to increase your profits. I'm aware that there are production systems where I would get more yield per plant if I wanted to go out there and pump them full of fish emulsion with drip tape and prune every single plant and trellis them and go out and spray them with BT and neem oil, and yeah, I might get higher yields per plant, but I'm going for sustainability and I'm going for getting good at low input farming. I think that we need to get comfortable growing crops without a lot of fancy stuff. As gardeners, sometimes we really enjoy the latest, greatest potting mix and fertilizers and all these high-end things, and I think post-collapse we're not going to have a lot of that. So if you get good at growing food with pretty minimal inputs, like I said, I wasn't out there pulling weeds. I planted some cover crops last winter, and there's still a bunch of clover out there. I got volunteer zinnias all over the front yard that I didn't plant, but those are choking out some weeds. A lot of these tomato vines you couldn't even see underneath the zinnias. You look at the front yard and it's just a sea of blooming flowers, and then underneath the flowers there's a bunch of wrangly tomato vines growing everywhere, and that's kind of cool. This was maybe 5 or 6 plants in total, and I put very little work into this. There were a few fruits that did rot. They were sitting on the ground and it probably rained a lot. But that's alright. The ones that are rotted, I just toss them into the backyard, and then I get volunteer tomatoes the next year. And if you continue to select for disease resistance, save seed every year, you'll eventually kind of select out your own landrace populations that are well adapted to your specific area and your environment. So I just wanted to share that with y'all, and I encourage everyone to look up Masanobu Fukuoka. He has a couple different books: One Straw Revolution, Do Nothing Farming, Ecological Farming, the idea that you work with nature instead of trying to force your will onto the environment. Yeah, thank y'all for tuning in, and I got a long day ahead of me making marinara sauce.